Chapter 11 of The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Johnny Dooit Does It. "It's getting awful rough walking," said Dorothy as they trudged along. Button-Bright gave a deep sigh and said he was hungry. Indeed, all were hungry and thirsty, too, for they had eaten nothing but the apples since breakfast, so their steps lagged and they grew silent and weary. At last they slowly passed over the crest of a barren hill, and saw before them a line of green trees with a strip of grass at their feet. An agreeable fragrance was wafted toward them. Our travelers, hot and tired, ran forward on beholding this refreshing sight, and were not long in coming to the trees. Here they found a spring of pure bubbling water, around which the grass was full of wild strawberry plants, their pretty red berries ripe and ready to eat. Some of the trees bore yellow oranges and some russet pears, so the hungry adventurers suddenly found themselves provided with plenty to eat and to drink. They lost no time in picking the biggest strawberries and ripest oranges, and soon had feasted to their hearts' content. Walking beyond the line of trees, they saw before them a fearful, dismal desert, everywhere gray sand. At the edge of this awful waste was a large white sign with black letters neatly painted upon it, and the letters made these words: "All persons are warned not to venture upon this desert, for the deadly sands will turn any living flesh to dust in an instant. Beyond this barrier is the land of Oz, but no one can reach that beautiful country because of these destroying sands." "Oh," said Dorothy, when the Shaggy Man had read the sign aloud, "I've seen this desert before, and it's true. No one can live who tries to walk upon the sands." "Then we mustn't try it," answered the Shaggy Man thoughtfully. "But as we can't go ahead, and there's no use going back, what shall we do next?" "Don't know," said Button-Bright. "I'm sure I don't know either," added Dorothy despondently. "I wish father would come for me," sighed the pretty Rainbow's Daughter. "I would take you all to live upon the rainbow, where you could dance along its rays from morning till night, without a care or worry of any sort. But I suppose father's too busy just now to search the world for me." "Don't want to dance," said Button-Bright, sitting down wearily upon the soft grass. "It's very good of you, Polly," said Dorothy, "but there are other things that would suit me better than dancing on rainbows. I'm 'fraid they'd be kind of soft and squashy underfoot, anyhow, although they're so pretty to look at." This didn't help to solve the problem, and they all fell silent and looked at one another questioningly. "Really, I don't know what to do," muttered the Shaggy Man, gazing hard at Toto, and the little dog wagged his tail and said "Bow wow!" just as if he could not tell either what to do. Button-Bright got a stick and began to dig in the earth, and the others watched him for a while in deep thought. Finally the Shaggy Man said: "It's nearly evening now, so we may as well sleep in this pretty place and get rested. Perhaps by morning we can decide what is best to be done." There was little chance to make beds for the children, but the leaves of the tree grew thickly and would serve to keep off the night dews. So the Shaggy Man piled soft grasses in the thickest shade, and when it was dark they lay down and slept peacefully until morning. Long after the others were asleep, however, the Shaggy Man sat in the starlight by the spring, gazing thoughtfully into its bubbling waters. Suddenly he smiled and nodded to himself, as if he had found a good thought, after which he too laid himself down under a tree and was soon lost in slumber. In the bright morning sunshine, as they ate of the strawberries and sweet juicy pears, Dorothy said: "Polly, can you do any magic?" "No, dear," answered Polychrome, shaking her dainty head. "You ought to know some magic, being the Rainbow's Daughter," continued Dorothy earnestly. "But we who live on the rainbow among the fleecy clouds have no use for magic," replied Polychrome. "What I'd like," said Dorothy, is to find some way to cross the desert to the land of Oz and its Emerald City. I've crossed it already, you know, more than once. First a cyclone carried my house over, and some silver shoes brought me back again in half a second. Then Ozma took me over on her magic carpet, and the Nome King's magic belt took me home that time. You see, it was magic that did it every time, 'cept the first, and we can't 'spect a cyclone to happen along and take us to the Emerald City now." "No, indeed," returned Polly with a shudder. "I hate cyclones anyway." "That's why I wanted to find out if you could do any magic," said the little Kansas girl. "I'm sure I can't, and I'm sure Button-Bright can't, and the only magic the Shaggy Man has is the Love Magnet, which won't help us much." "Don't be too sure of that, my dear," spoke the Shaggy Man, a smile on his donkey face. "I may not be able to do magic myself, but I can call to us a powerful friend who loves me because I own the Love Magnet, and this friend surely will be able to help us." "Who is your friend?" asked Dorothy. "Johnny Dooit." "What can Johnny do?" "Anything," answered the Shaggy Man with confidence. "Ask him to come," she exclaimed eagerly. The Shaggy Man took the Love Magnet from his pocket and unwrapped the paper that surrounded it. Holding the charm in the palm of his hand, he looked at it steadily and said these words: "Dear Johnny Dooit, come to me. I need you bad as bad can be." "Well, here I am," said a cheery little voice. "But you shouldn't say you need me bad, 'cause I'm always, always good." At this they quickly whirled around to find a funny little man sitting on a big copper chest, puffing smoke from a long pipe. His hair was gray, his whiskers were gray, and these whiskers were so long that he had wound the ends of them around his waist and tied them in a hard knot underneath the leather apron that reached from his chin nearly to his feet, and which was soiled and scratched as if it had been used a long time. His nose was broad and stuck up a little, but his eyes were twinkling and merry. The little man's hands and arms were as hard and tough as the leather in his apron, and Dorothy thought Johnny Dooit looked as if he had done a lot of hard work in his lifetime. "Good morning, Johnny," said the Shaggy Man. "Thank you for coming to me so quickly." "I never waste time," said the newcomer promptly. "But what's happened to you? Where did you get that donkey head? Really, I wouldn't have known you at all, Shaggy Man, if I hadn't looked at your feet." The Shaggy Man introduced Johnny Dooit to Dorothy and Toto and Button-Bright and the Rainbow's Daughter, and told him the story of their adventures, adding that they were anxious now to reach the Emerald City in the Land of Oz, where Dorothy had friends who would take care of them and send them safe home again. "But," said he, "we find that we can't cross this desert, which turns all living flesh that touches it into dust. So I have asked you to come and help us." Johnny Dooit puffed his pipe and looked carefully at the dreadful desert in front of them, stretching so far away they could not see its end. "You must ride," he said briskly. "What in?" asked the Shaggy Man. "In a sand boat, which has runners like a sled and sails like a ship. The wind will blow you swiftly across the desert, and the sand cannot touch your flesh to turn it into dust." "Good!" cried Dorothy, clapping her hands delightedly. "That was the way the magic carpet took us across. We didn't have to touch the horrid sand at all." "But where is the sand boat?" asked the Shaggy Man, looking all around him. "I'll make you one," said Johnny Dooit. As he spoke, he knocked the ashes from his pipe and put it in his pocket. Then he unlocked the copper chest and lifted the lid, and Dorothy saw it was full of shining tools of all sorts and shapes. Johnny Dooit moved quickly now, so quickly that they were astonished at the work he was able to accomplish. He had in his chest a tool for everything he wanted to do, and these must have been magic tools, because they did their work so fast and so well. The man hummed a little song as he worked, and Dorothy tried to listen to it. She thought the words were something like these: "The only way to do a thing is do it when you can, and do it cheerfully and sing and work and think and plan. The only real unhappy one is one who dares to shirk. The only really happy one is one who cares to work. Whatever Johnny Dooit was singing, he was certainly doing things, and they all stood by and watched him in amazement. He seized an axe, and in a couple of chops felled a tree. Next he took a saw, and in a few minutes sawed the tree trunk into broad, long boards. He then nailed the boards together into the shape of a boat about 12 feet long and 4 feet wide. He cut from another tree a long, slender pole which, when trimmed of its branches and fastened upright in the center of the boat, served as a mast. From the chest he drew a coil of rope and a big bundle of canvas, and with these, still humming his song, he rigged up a sail, arranging it so it could be raised or lowered upon the mast. Dorothy fairly gasped with wonder to see the thing grow so speedily before her eyes, and both Button-Bright and Polly looked on with the same absorbed interest. "It ought to be painted," said Johnny Dooit, tossing his tools back into the chest, "for that would make it look prettier. But though I can paint it for you in 3 seconds, it would take an hour to dry, and that's a waste of time." "We don't care how it looks," said the Shaggy Man, "if only it will take us across the desert." "It will do that," declared Johnny Dooit. "All you need worry about is tipping over. Did you ever sail a ship?" "I've seen one sailed," said the Shaggy Man. "Good. Sail this boat the way you've seen a ship sailed, and you'll be across the sands before you know it." With this he slammed down the lid of the chest, and the noise made them all wink. While they were winking, the workmen disappeared, tools and all. End of chapter 11. The Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Deadly Desert Crossed. "Oh, that's too bad," cried Dorothy. "I wanted to thank Johnny Dooit for all his kindness to us." "He hasn't time to listen to thanks," replied the Shaggy Man, "but I'm sure he knows we are grateful. I suppose he is already at work in some other part of the world." They now looked more carefully at the sand boat, and saw that the bottom was molded with 2 sharp runners which would glide through the sand. The front of the boat was pointed like the bow of a ship, and there was a rudder at the stern to steer by. It had been built just at the edge of the desert, so that all its length lay upon the gray sand except the after part, which still rested on the strip of grass. "Get in, my dears," said the Shaggy Man. "I'm sure I can manage this boat as well as any sailor. All you need do is sit still in your places." Dorothy got in, Toto in her arms, and sat on the bottom of the boat just in front of the mast. Button-Bright sat in front of Dorothy, while Polly leaned over the bow. The Shaggy Man knelt behind the mast. When all were ready, he raised the sail halfway. The wind caught it. At once the sand boat started forward, slowly at first, then with added speed. The Shaggy Man pulled the sail way up, and they flew so fast over the Deadly Desert that everyone held fast to the sides of the boat and scarcely dared to breathe. The sand lay in billows and was in places very uneven, so that the boat rocked dangerously from side to side, but it never quite tipped over, and the speed was so great that the Shaggy Man himself became frightened and began to wonder how he could make the ship go slower. "If we're spilled in the sand in the middle of the desert," Dorothy thought to herself, "we'll be nothing but dust in a few minutes, and that will be the end of us." But they were not spilled, and by Polychrome, who was clinging to the bow and looking straight ahead, saw a dark line before them and wondered what it was. It grew plainer every second until she discovered it to be a row of jagged rocks at the edge of the desert, while high above these rocks she could see a tableland of green grass and beautiful trees. "Look out!" she screamed to the Shaggy Man. "Go slowly, or we shall smash into the rocks." He heard her and tried to pull down the sail, but the wind would not let go of the broad canvas, and the ropes had become tangled. Nearer and nearer they drew to the great rocks, and the Shaggy Man was in despair because he could do nothing to stop the wild rush of the sand boat. They reached the edge of the desert and bumped squarely into the rocks. There was a crash as Dorothy, Button-Bright, Toto, and Polly flew up in the air in a curve like a skyrocket's, one after another, landing high upon the grass, where they rolled and tumbled for a time before they could stop themselves. The Shaggy Man flew after them, head first, and lighted in a heap beside Toto, who, being much excited at the time, seized one of the donkey's ears between his teeth and shook and worried it as hard as he could, growling angrily. The Shaggy Man made the little dog let go, and sat up to look around him. Dorothy was feeling one of her front teeth, which was loosened by knocking against her knee as she fell. Polly was looking sorrowfully at a rent in her pretty gauze gown, and Button-Bright's fox head had stuck fast in a gopher hole, and he was wiggling his little fat legs frantically in an effort to get free. Otherwise they were unhurt by the adventure, so the Shaggy Man stood up and pulled Button-Bright out of the hole, and went to the edge of the desert to look at the sand boat. It was a mere mass of splinters now, crushed out of shape against the rocks. The wind had torn away the sail and carried it to the top of a tall tree, where the fragments of it fluttered like a white flag. "Well," he said cheerfully, "we're here, but where the here is I don't know." "It must be some part of the Land of Oz," observed Dorothy, coming to his side. "Must it? 'Course it must. We're across the desert, aren't we? And somewhere in the middle of Oz is the Emerald City." "To be sure," said the Shaggy Man, nodding. "Let's go there." "But I don't see any people about to show us the way," she continued. "Let's hunt for them," he suggested. "There must be people somewhere, but perhaps they did not expect us, and so were not at hand to give us a welcome." End of Chapter 12. Of the Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Truth Pond. They now made a more careful examination of the country around them. All was fresh and beautiful after the sultriness of the desert, and the sunshine and sweet, crisp air were delightful to the wanderers. Little mounds of yellowish green were away at the right, while on the left waved a group of tall, leafy trees that looked like tassels and pom-poms. Among the grasses carpeting the ground were pretty buttercups and cowslips and marigolds. After looking at these a moment, Dorothy said reflectively, "We must be in the country of the Winkies, for the color of that country is yellow, and you will notice that most everything here is yellow that has any color at all." "But I thought this was the Land of Oz," replied the Shaggy Man, as if greatly disappointed. "So it is," she declared, "but there are 4 parts to the Land of Oz. The North Country is purple, and it's the country of the Gillikins. The East Country is blue, and that's the country of the Munchkins. Down at the South is the Red Country of the Quadlings, and here in the West the Yellow Country of the Winkies. This is the part that is ruled by the Tin Woodman, you know." "Who's he?" asked Button-Bright. "Why, he's the Tin Woodman I told you about. His name is Nick Chopper, and he has a lovely heart given him by the wonderful Wizard." "Where does he live?" asked the boy. "The Wizard? Oh, he lives in the Emerald City, which is just in the middle of Oz, where the corners of the 4 countries meet." "Oh," said Button-Bright, puzzled by this explanation. "We must be some distance from the Emerald City," remarked the Shaggy Man. "That's true," she replied. "So we'd better start on and see if we can find any of the Winkies. They're nice people," she continued, as the little party began walking toward the group of trees. "And I came here once with my friends the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman and the Cowardly Lion to fight a wicked witch who had made all the Winkies her slaves." "Did you conquer her?" asked Polly. "Why, I melted her with a bucket of water, and that was the end of her," replied Dorothy. "After that the people were free, you know, and they made Nick Chopper, that's the Tin Woodman, their Emperor." "What's that?" asked Button Bright. "Emperor? Oh, it's something like an alderman, I think." "Oh," said the boy. "But I thought Princess Ozma ruled Oz," said the Shaggy Man. "So she does. She rules the Emerald City and all the 4 countries of Oz, but each country has another little ruler, not so big as Ozma. It's like the officers of an army, you see. The little rulers are all captains, and Ozma's the general." By this time they had reached the trees, which stood in a perfect circle, and just far enough so that their thick branches touched, or shook hands, as Button Bright remarked. Under the shade of the trees they found, in the center of the circle, a crystal pool, its waters as still as glass. It must have been deep, too, for when Polychrome bent over it she gave a little sigh of pleasure. "Why, it's a mirror!" she cried, for she could see all her pretty face and fluffy rainbow-tinted gown reflected in the pool, as natural as life. Dorothy bent over, too, and began to arrange her hair, blown by the desert wind into straggling tangles. Button Bright leaned over the edge next, and then began to cry, for the sight of his fox head frightened the poor little fellow. "I guess I won't look," remarked the Shaggy Man sadly, for he didn't like his donkey head either. While Polly and Dorothy tried to comfort Button Bright, the Shaggy Man sat down near the edge of the pool, where his image could not be reflected, and stared at the water thoughtfully. As he did this he noticed a silver plate fastened to a rock just under the surface of the water, and on the silver plate was engraved these words: "The Truth Pond." "Ah!" cried the Shaggy Man, springing to his feet with eager joy. "We've found it at last." "Found what?" asked Dorothy, running to him. "The Truth Pond. Now at last I may get rid of this frightful head, for we were told, you remember, that only the Truth Pond could restore to me my proper face." "Me too!" shouted Button Bright, trotting up to them. "Of course," said Dorothy. "It will cure you both of your bad heads, I guess. Isn't it lucky we found it?" "It is, indeed," replied the Shaggy Man. "I hated dreadfully to go to Princess Ozma looking like this, and she's to have a birthday celebration, too." Just then a splash startled them, for Button Bright, in his anxiety to see the pool that would cure him, had stepped too near the edge and tumbled heels over head into the water. Down he went, out of sight entirely, so that only his sailor hat floated on the top of the Truth Pond. He soon bobbed up, and the Shaggy Man seized him by his sailor collar and dragged him to the shore, dripping and gasping for breath. They all looked upon the boy wonderingly, for the fox head, with its sharp nose and pointed ears, was gone, and in its place appeared the chubby round face and blue eyes and pretty curls that had belonged to Button Bright before King Dox of Foxville transformed him. "Oh, what a darling!" cried Polly, and would have hugged the little one had he not been so wet. Their joyful exclamations made the child rub the water out of his eyes and look at his friends questioningly. "You're all right now, dear," said Dorothy. "Come and look at yourself." She led him to the pool, and although there were still a few ripples on the surface of the water, he could see his reflection plainly. "It's me!" he said, in a pleased yet awed whisper. "Of course it is," replied the girl, "and we're all as glad as you are, Button Bright." "Well," announced the Shaggy Man, "it's my turn next." He took off his shaggy coat and laid it on the grass and dived head first into the Truth Pond. When he came up, the donkey head had disappeared, and the Shaggy Man's own shaggy head was in its place, with the water dripping in little streams from his shaggy whiskers. He scrambled ashore and shook himself to get off some of the wet, and then leaned over the pool to look admiringly at his reflected face. "I may not be strictly beautiful even now," he said to his companions, who watched him with smiling faces, "but I'm so much handsomer than any donkey that I feel as proud as I can be." "You're all right, Shaggy Man," declared Dorothy, "and Button Bright is all right, too. So let's thank the Truth Pond for being so nice, and start on our journey to the Emerald City." "I hate to leave it," murmured the Shaggy Man with a sigh. "A Truth Pond wouldn't be a bad thing to carry around with us." But he put on his coat and started with the others in search of someone to direct them on their way. End of chapter 13. Of the Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. Tik-Tok and Ballina. They had not walked far across the flower-strewn meadows when they came upon a fine road leading toward the northwest and winding gracefully among the pretty yellow hills. "That way," said Dorothy, "must be the direction of the Emerald City. We'd better follow the road until we meet someone or come to a house." The sun soon dried Button Bright's sailor suit and the Shaggy Man's shaggy clothes, and so pleased were they at regaining their own heads that they did not mind at all the brief discomfort of getting wet. "It's good to be able to whistle again," remarked the Shaggy Man, "for those donkey lips were so thick I could not whistle a note with them." He warbled a tune as merrily as any bird. "You'll look more natural at the birthday celebration, too," said Dorothy, happy in seeing her friends so happy. Polychrome was dancing ahead in her usual sprightly manner, whirling gaily along the smooth, level road until she passed from sight around the curve of one of the mounds. Suddenly they heard her exclaim, "Oh!" and she appeared again, running toward them at full speed. "What's the matter, Polly?" asked Dorothy, perplexed. There was no need for the Rainbow's Daughter to answer, for turning the bend in the road there came advancing slowly toward them a funny round man made of burnished copper, gleaming brightly in the sun. Perched on the copper man's shoulder sat a yellow hen with fluffy feathers and a pearl necklace around her throat. "Oh, Tik-Tok!" cried Dorothy, running forward. When she came to him the copper man lifted the little girl in his copper arms and kissed her cheek with his copper lips. "Oh, Ballina!" cried Dorothy in a glad voice, and the yellow hen flew to her arms to be hugged and petted by turns. The others were curiously crowding around the group, and the girl said to them, "It's Tik-Tok and Ballina, and oh, I'm so glad to see them again." "Welcome to Oz," said the copper man in a monotonous voice. Dorothy sat right down in the road, the yellow hen in her arms, and began to stroke Billina's back. Said the hen, "Dorothy, dear, I've got some wonderful news to tell you." "Tell it quick, Billina," said the girl. Just then Toto, who had been growling to himself in a cross way, gave a sharp bark and flew at the yellow hen, who ruffled her feathers and let out such an angry screech that Dorothy was startled. "Stop, Toto! Stop that this minute!" she commanded. "Can't you see that Billina is my friend?" In spite of this warning, had she not grabbed Toto quickly by the neck, the little dog would have done the yellow hen a mischief, and even now he struggled madly to escape Dorothy's grasp. She slapped his ears once or twice and told him to behave, and the yellow hen flew to Tik-Tok's shoulder again, where she was safe. "What a brute!" croaked Billina, glaring down at the little dog. "Toto isn't a brute," replied Dorothy, "but at home Uncle Henry has to whip him sometimes for chasing the chickens. Now look here, Toto," she added, holding up her finger and speaking sternly to him, "you've got to understand that Billina is one of my dearest friends and mustn't be hurt, now or ever." Toto wagged his tail as if he understood. "The miserable thing can't talk," said Billina with a sneer. "Yes, he can," replied Dorothy. "He talks with his tail, and I know everything he says. If you could wag your tail, Billina, you wouldn't need words to talk." "Nonsense!" said Billina. "It isn't nonsense at all. Just now Toto says he's sorry, and that he'll try to love you for my sake. Don't you, Toto?" "Wow, wow," said Toto, wagging his tail again. "But I've such wonderful news for you, Dorothy," cried the yellow hen. "I've—" "Wait a minute, dear," interrupted the little girl. "I've got to introduce you all first. That's manners, Billina. This," turning to her traveling companions, "is Mr. Tik-Tok, who works by machinery, 'cause his thoughts wind up, and his talk winds up, and his actions winds up like a clock." "Do they all wind up together?" asked the Shaggy Man. "No, each one separate, but he works just lovely. And Tik-Tok was a good friend to me once, and saved my life, and Billina's life, too." "Is he alive?" asked Button-Bright, looking hard at the copper man. "Oh, no, but his machinery makes him just as good as alive." She turned to the copper man and said politely, "Mr. Tik-Tok, these are my new friends, the Shaggy Man, and Polly the Rainbow's daughter, and Button-Bright and Toto, only Toto isn't a new friend, 'cause he's been to Oz before." The copper man bowed low, removing his copper hat as he did so. "I'm very pleased to meet Dorothy's fur—" Here he stopped short. "Oh, I guess his speech needs winding," said the little girl, running behind the copper man to get the key off a hook at his back. She wound him up in a place under his right arm, and he went on to say, "Pardon me for running down. I was about to say I am pleased to meet Dorothy's friends, who must be my friends." The words were somewhat jerky, but plain to understand. "And this is Billina," continued Dorothy, introducing the yellow hen, and they all bowed to her in turn. "I've such wonderful news," said the hen, turning her head so that one bright eye looked full at Dorothy. "What is it, dear?" asked the girl. "I've hatched out 10 of the loveliest chicks you ever saw." "Oh, how nice! And where are they, Billina?" "I left them at home, but they're beauties, I assure you, and all wonderfully clever. I've named them Dorothy." "Which one?" asked the girl. "All of them," replied Billina. "That's funny. Why did you name them all with the same name?" "It was so hard to tell them apart," explained the hen. "Now, when I call Dorothy, they all come running to me in a bunch. It's much easier, after all, than having a separate name for each." "I'm just dying to see 'em, Billina," said Dorothy eagerly. "But tell me, my friends, how did you happen to be here in the country of the Winkies, the first of all to meet us?" "I'll tell you," answered Tik-Tok in his monotonous voice, all the sounds of his words being on one level. "Princess Ozma saw you in her magic picture and knew you were coming here, so she sent Billina and me to welcome you, as she could not come herself, so that fizz dig look come lucking bergob lip in do z." "Good gracious, what's the matter now?" cried Dorothy, as the copper man continued to babble these unmeaning words, which no one could understand at all, because they had no sense. "Don't know," said Button-Bright, who was half scared. Polly whirled away to a distance and turned to look at the copper man in a fright. "His thoughts have run down this time," remarked Billina composedly, as she sat on Tik-Tok's shoulder and pruned her sleek feathers. "When he can't think, he can't talk properly, any more than you can. You'll have to wind up his thoughts, Dorothy, or else I'll have to finish his story myself." Dorothy ran around and got the key again and wound up Tik-Tok under his left arm, after which he could speak plainly again. "Pardon me," he said, "but when my thoughts run down, my speech has no meaning, for words are formed only by thoughts. I was about to say that Ozma sent us to welcome you, and to invite you to come straight to the Emerald City. She was too busy to come herself, for she is preparing for her birthday celebration, which is to be a grand affair." "I've heard of it," said Dorothy, "and I'm glad we've come in time to attend. Is it far from here to the Emerald City?" "Not very far," answered Tik-Tok, "and we have plenty of time. Tonight we will stop at the palace of the Tin Woodman, and tomorrow night we will arrive at the Emerald City." "Goody!" cried Dorothy. "I'd like to see dear Nick Chopper again. How's his heart?" "It's fine," said Ballina. "The Tin Woodman says it gets softer and kindlier every day. He's waiting at his castle to welcome you, Dorothy, but he couldn't come with us because he's getting polished as bright as possible for Ozma's party." "Well, then," said Dorothy, "let's start on, and we can talk more as we go." They proceeded on their journey in a friendly group, for Polychrome had discovered that the copper man was harmless, and was no longer afraid of him. Button-Bright was also reassured, and took quite a fancy to Tik-Tok. He wanted the Clockwork Man to open himself, so that he might see the wheels go round, but that was a thing Tik-Tok could not do. Button-Bright then wanted to wind up the copper man, and Dorothy promised he should do so as soon as any part of the machinery ran down. This pleased Button-Bright, who held fast to one of Tik-Tok's copper hands as he trudged along the road, while Dorothy walked on the other side of her old friend, and Billina perched by turns upon his shoulder or his copper hat. Polly once more joyously danced ahead, and Toto ran after her, barking with glee. The Shaggy Man was left to walk behind, but he didn't seem to mind a bit, and whistled merrily and looked curiously upon the pretty scenes they passed. At last they came to a hilltop from which the tin castle of Nick Chopper could plainly be seen, its towers glistening magnificently under the rays of the declining sun. "How pretty!" exclaimed Dorothy. "I've never seen the Emperor's new house before." "He built it because the old castle was damp and likely to rust his tin body," said Billina. "All those towers and steeples and domes and gables took a lot of tin, as you can see." "Is it a toy?" asked Button-Bright softly. "No, dear," answered Dorothy. "It's better than that. It's the fairy dwelling of a fairy prince." End of Chapter 14. Of the Road to Oz by L. Frank Baum. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Emperor's Tin Castle. The grounds around Nick Chopper's new house were laid out in pretty flower beds, with fountains of crystal water and statues of tin representing the Emperor's personal friends. Dorothy was astonished and delighted to find a tin statue of herself standing on a tin pedestal at a bend in the avenue leading up to the entrance. It was life size, and showed her in her sunbonnet with her basket on her arm, just as she had first appeared in the Land of Oz. "Oh, Toto, you're there too!" she exclaimed, and sure enough, there was the tin figure of Toto lying at the tin Dorothy's feet. Also, Dorothy saw figures of the Scarecrow and the Wizard and Ozma and many others, including Tik-Tok. They reached the grand tin entrance to the tin castle, and the Tin Woodman himself came running out of the door to embrace little Dorothy and give her a glad welcome. He welcomed her friends as well, and the Rainbow's Daughter he declared to be the loveliest vision his tin eyes had ever beheld. He patted Button-Bright's curly head tenderly, for he was fond of children, and turned to the Shaggy Man and shook both his hands at the same time. Nick Chopper, the Emperor of the Winkies, who was also known throughout the Land of Oz as the Tin Woodman, was certainly a remarkable person. He was neatly made, all of tin, nicely soldered at the joints, and his various limbs were cleverly hinged to his body, so that he could use them nearly as well as if they had been common flesh. Once, he told the Shaggy Man, he had been made of all flesh and bones, as other people are, and then he chopped wood in the forests to earn his living, but the axe slipped so often and cut off parts of him, which he had replaced with tin, that finally there was no flesh left, nothing but tin, so he became a real Tin Woodman. the wonderful Wizard of Oz had given him an excellent heart to replace his old one, and he didn't mind at all being 10. Everyone loved him, he loved everyone, and he was therefore as happy as the day was long. The Emperor was proud of his new tin castle, and showed his visitors through all the rooms. Every bit of the furniture was made of brightly polished tin. The tables, chairs, beds, and all, even the floors and walls, were of tin. "I suppose," said he, "that there are no cleverer tinsmiths in all the world than the Winkies. It would be hard to match this castle in Kansas, wouldn't it, little Dorothy?" "Very hard," replied the child gravely. "It must have cost a lot of money," remarked the Shaggy Man. "Money? Money in Oz?" cried the Tin Woodman. "What a queer idea! Do you suppose we are so vulgar as to use money here?" "Why not?" asked the Shaggy Man. "If we used money to buy things with, instead of love and kindness and the desire to please one another, then we should be no better than the rest of the world," declared the Tin Woodman. "Fortunately, money is not known in the Land of Oz at all. We have no rich and no poor, for what one wishes the others all try to give him, in order to make him happy, and no one in all Oz cares to have more than he can use." "Good!" cried the Shaggy Man, greatly pleased to hear this. "I also despise money. A man in Butterfield owes me 15 cents, and I will not take it from him. The Land of Oz is surely the most favored land in all the world, and its people the happiest. I should like to live here always." The Tin Woodman listened with respectful attention. Already he loved the Shaggy Man, although he did not yet know of the Love Magnet. So he said: "If you can prove to the Princess Ozma that you are honest and true and worthy of our friendship, you may indeed live here all your days and be happy as we are." "I'll try to prove that," said the Shaggy Man earnestly. "And now," continued the Emperor, "you must all go to your rooms and prepare for dinner, which will presently be served in the grand tin dining hall. I'm sorry, Shaggy Man, that I cannot offer you a change of clothing, but I dress only in tin myself, and I suppose that would not suit you." "I care little about dress," said the Shaggy Man indifferently. "So I should imagine," replied the Emperor with true politeness. They were shown to their rooms and permitted to make such toilets as they could, and soon they assembled again in the grand tin dining hall, even Toto being present. For the Emperor was fond of Dorothy's little dog, and the girl explained to her friends that in Oz all animals were treated with as much consideration as the people, if they behaved themselves, she added. Toto behaved himself, and sat in a tin high chair beside Dorothy and ate his dinner from a tin platter. Indeed, they all ate from tin dishes, but these were of pretty shapes and brightly polished. Dorothy thought they were just as good as silver. Button-Bright looked curiously at the man who had no appetite inside him, for the Tin Woodman, although he had prepared so fine a feast for his guests, ate not a mouthful himself, sitting patiently in his place to see that all built so they could eat were well and plentifully served. What pleased Button-Bright most about the dinner was the tin orchestra that played sweet music while the company ate. The players were not tin, being just ordinary Winkies, but the instruments they played upon were all tin: tin trumpets, tin fiddles, tin drums, and cymbals and flutes and horns and all. They played so nicely the Shining Emperor Waltz, composed expressly in honor of the Tin Woodman by Mr. H. M. Wogglebug, T.E., that Polly could not resist dancing to it. After she had tasted a few dewdrops freshly gathered for her, she danced gracefully to the music, while the others finished their repast, and when she whirled until her fleecy draperies of rainbow hues enveloped her like a cloud, the Tin Woodman was so delighted that he clapped his tin hands until the noise of them drowned out the sound of the cymbals. Altogether it was a merry meal, although Polychrome ate little and the host nothing at all. "I'm sorry the Rainbow's Daughter missed her mist cakes," said the Tin Woodman to Dorothy, But by a mistake Miss Polly's mist cakes were mislaid and not missed until now. I'll try to have some for her breakfast." They spent the evening telling stories, and the next morning left the splendid tin castle and set out upon the road to the Emerald City. The Tin Woodman went with them, of course, having by this time been so brightly polished that he sparkled like silver. His axe, which he always carried with him, had a steel blade that was tin plated, and a handle covered with tin plate beautifully engraved and set with diamonds. The Winkies assembled before the castle gates and cheered their Emperor as he marched away, and it was easy to see that they all loved him dearly. Chapter 16